I always enjoyed working at night. I'm a photographer, you know? And the city's deserted streets have a beauty that the day never shows. Neon's lights reflecting on puddles, the silence that almost zombie in the ears, the smell of wet asphalt after the rain. My shift starts when the rest of the world sleeps, and I take my camera to capture what no one else sees. It's not just by choice, it's a need to. Daytime freeloss pay little, and I like loneliness. At least I liked it. Everything changed a few weeks ago when I started to notice something in my photos. A shadow. Not any shadow, but something that made no sense to be there, always appearing in the images I took exactly at 3:33 in the morning. At first, I thought it was just a strange lens or a stray defect. I used my old Nikon, who already had some scratches, so I didn't give much ball. But then, on a cold night, as I adjusted my focus to photograph a crooked pole on an empty street, I saw it again. A dark, half-blurred shape, as if someone had passed fast through the corner of the painting. But there was no one there. I swear. I looked around. The place was dead. Just the sound of the wind and the tinnitus of the broken lamp. I opened the photo on the camera display right there, and there she was, clearer this time. It looked like a human but crooked outline, as if the arms were too long. My heart was accelerated, but I took a deep breath and thought, calm down. It's just coincidence. Little did I know that it was going to get worse. I tried to ignore. I returned home that night, but the feeling that something was wrong stuck to me like a bad smell. Solitude never bothered me before, but that night it seemed to have weight. The next day, I downloaded the photos from the notebook to edit, and then it was really weird. All the images taken at 3:33 had that shadow. No matter the angle, the place, the light, she was there, always in the corner, as if she spied on me. In a photo, it seemed closer, almost halfway through the painting, and you could notice a detail that I had not seen before. A kind of hand with long, thin, half-curved fingers. My chest squeezed, and I dropped the glass of water that was holding. The noise of the glass breaking echoed in the empty apartment, and I felt a shiver up the back of the neck. I decided to test. The next night I left again, camera in hand, heart in my mouth. I chose a narrow alley behind an abandoned bar, a place I already knew well. The cell phone clock scored 3:32, and I waited, the finger on the button, sweating cold despite the cold wind. When it gave 3:33, I clicked. The flash exploded in the dark, and for a moment I saw something moving, not walking, but sliding, as if the feet didn't touch the floor. A dry sound, like old wood crackling, echoed through the alley. I opened the picture on the display, and there was the shadow even closer, almost toward me. This time you could see a half-leaned head contour, as if it is looking at me. I dropped the camera on the floor by reflection, my heart hitting so hard that it seemed to explode. That's when I realized that was no defect. That knew I was seeing. I couldn't sleep well after that. I spent the rest of the dawn walking around the apartment, with the lights all lit, looking at the curtains as if something came there. The camera was thrown at the table, and I didn't even have the courage to touch her. But the worst was the sensation, that weight in the chest, as if someone was watching me even being alone. I tried to rationalize, it's just stress. You're seeing something where you don't have. But then I remembered the pictures, those long hands, the crooked head, and the fear came back like a wave. I decided to check the history of the images to see if I found any pattern, some explanation. But the more I looked, the clearer it was. The shadow was approaching, photo by photo, night by night. The next day I was a rag, but I left again. I needed to understand what was happening, or at least prove that it was not going crazy. I took the camera, changed the lens, even cleaned the sensor, anything to convince me that it was a technical defect. I went to an old road near the city, a deserted place, only bush and crooked posts. At 3:33, I took the picture, aiming at an abandoned car covered with rust. The flash shot, and this time I smelled strange in the air, sulfur mixed with mold. When I looked at the image, The shadow was so close that it occupied half the picture. I could see the outline of the body now, too thin, with legs that looked bent the opposite. I shouted, dropped the camera again, and ran to the car, locking the doors as if it would save me. I drove home with hands shaking on the wheel, my heart in the throat. The radio was off, but I swear I heard a low squeak, as if something tried to speak through silence. When I arrived, I locked the door and threw the keys on the table, trying to convince myself that it was safe. But that smell of sulfur and mold had followed me, hanging in the air like an invisible mist. I took the notebook and opened all the photos again, one by one, enlarging the corners. In each image, the shadow was more defined, more real. In the last picture, the eyes were their two white, bright points. But then, before I could blink, they blinked back. I closed the notebook tightly, sweat dripping by the forehead, and I muttered to myself, "What do you want from me?" I don't know where I took courage, but I decided I needed to face it. If that thing was in the pictures, you might appear live if I insisted. That night, I went to an empty parking lot behind a closed market. The clock scored 3:30, and I stayed there, camera in hand, breathing fast, the cold air burning the lungs. At 3:33, I took the picture. The flash illuminated the old cars and the cracked floor. But this time, I saw something with my own eyes, even before checking the image. A thin, too tall figure stopped in the corner of the parking lot, looking at me. It wasn't just a shadow now, it was real, with those white eyes shining in the darkness. My body froze, and the camera slipped from my hands, hitting the floor with a dry crack. I couldn't move. That thing, whatever it was, stayed there, staring at me, and the silence of the parking lot seemed to scream in my ears. The white eyes did not flash, only crossed me, as if they knew everything about me. The sulfur smell became stronger, almost suffocating me, and I felt a cold climb by the legs, as if the floor had become ice. I tried to pick up the camera from the floor, but my hand was shaking so much that I could barely close my fingers. When I finally got it, I raised the display to look at the picture, and there she was, too clear. The whole figure with arms that hung to the knees, crooked legs, and a thin smile that should not be like that. My stomach rolled, and I let out a low moan, almost a cry. I ran to the car, but each step seemed slower, as if the air was thick. I looked back once, and she was still there, but now closer, as if she had slid without me noticing. I locked the doors and broke the tires, singing on the asphalt. In the rearview mirror, I saw nothing, but I knew she was following me. I felt. I got home and knocked the door, throwing the camera in the corner of my bedroom. I sat on the floor, leaning against the wall, trying to breathe, but the air was not properly. The clock scored 3:45, and for a second I thought it was free, until I heard a sound from the window, a light scratch like nails on the glass. I looked up, and outside, in the darkness, those white points stared at me again. I don't know how long I stood there, looking at that white eyes across the window. My chest climbed and descended fast, but I couldn't scream or move. The scratch on the glass became louder, more insistent, and then stopped suddenly, leaving only the silence. I thought it was a relief, but it was worse. The silence looked alive, heavy, as if something was waiting for me to lower my guard. I ran to get my cell phone and call someone, anyone, but the screen blinked and went out even with the full battery. The sulfur smell invaded the room, and I heard a new sound, a low whisper, coming from all sides, like wind going through holes. I couldn't understand the words, but I knew it was for me. I took the camera again, almost as instinct, and opened the photos on the display. I rolled to the first one, that of the crooked post, and realized something that had been beaten. The whole sequence, the shadow was never alone. There were others, smaller, more blurred, in the corners of the images, as if they were a group slowly approaching. In the last photo of the parking lot, they were all there, behind the main figure, a swarm of crooked figures surrounding me. My heart stopped for a second, and I dropped the camera, staggering back. That's when the room light blinked and went out, leaving me in the dark. The whisper got louder, and I felt a cold touch on my shoulder, even though it was alone, or at least thinking it was. The touch on my shoulder finally shouted me, a hoarse sound that echoed in the dark room. I turned fast, but there was nothing there, just the darkness and that rotten smell swallowing me. I tried to run to the door, but stumbled on something that wasn't there before, falling on the floor. My hand hit the camera, and the display lit alone, showing the last photo. The figure was now inside the painting, the white eyes so large that they seemed to swallow me. I got up in a jump, the sweat dripping, and ran to the window, but it was locked, the glass blurred by finger like marks. The whisper became a low and constant choir, and I started knocking on the door, shouting for help, even though I knew no one would hear in an empty building by that time. Suddenly the lights came back, but it wasn't relief. It was worse. The camera was on the floor, pointed at me, and the flash fired alone, blinding me for a second. When my vision came back, I saw my reflection on the display. My eyes were different, more backgrounds, darker. For a moment, I thought I saw something moving inside them. My body froze, and I realized, too late, it was not just a shadow in the photos. It was something that was entering me, taking me piece by piece with each click. The room was quiet again, but I felt them, all of them, inside my head, whispering my name. I don't know how, but I took the camera and broke it to the floor, crying as the pieces flew. Only the whisper did not stop. And now, while I write this, I see my reflection on the screen, and the eyes are no longer mine.